In southwest central Pennsylvania, among the foothills of the Alleghenies, lies the peaceful and picturesque valley of the Little Conemaugh. Here, in 1889, within a stretch of a dozen miles, lay 5 industrious and thriving towns: South Fork, Mineral Point, Conemaugh, Woodvale, and Johnstown. The last of these, embracing as it did Cambria and Conemaugh Borough, was a city of 30,000 people. The population of South Fork was 2,000, Mineral Point had 800, Conemaugh and Woodvale about 2,500 each. The total population of the valley within the distance named could not have been far from 38,000. Johnstown was the center of interest as of population. Thither came on May 30th, Decoration Day, people from Altoona, Hollidaysburg, Somerset, Latrobe, Ebensburg, and Wilmore, and from the 4 other towns already mentioned. There was a great concourse, a long and impressive procession of soldiers and secret orders, with bands of music, flags, regalia, banners, bunting, and devices. With solemn pomp, the cemetery was visited, and flowers were strewn on the graves of the patriotic dead. This sad but pleasing duty ended, the procession turned again toward the city, and entering the opera house, listened to an eloquent oration. It was a day of more than ordinary interest and elation for Johnstown. The city stood happy and unsuspecting on the very brink of an awful doom. During the day the sky had been overcast, and there were occasional light showers. At nightfall the clouds lowered more heavily and seemed to descend nearer to the earth. At 9 o'clock there was a gentle rain. At 11 a tremendous downpour which continued with little interruption during the remainder of the night. It seemed as if the windows of heaven had been opened. Before 8 o'clock on the morning of the 31st of May, both streams were bank full. As the day advanced, the lower parts of the town were inundated. By 11 o'clock, there was a depth of 5 feet at the corner of Main and Market Streets, and at the Cambria Iron Company's store. Still higher, the waters rose. In the houses most exposed, carpets were removed from the floors, and pianos and organs were lifted on chairs and tables. Soon the 2 angry streams were mingling their waters in the business center of the town. Both streams had been as high before, but never both at the same time. Some thought the Cambria Iron Company, which had narrowed the channel below the stone bridge, was responsible and should be required to widen it again and so make a free exit for the waters. By 2 o'clock the water was 2 to 10 feet deep all over the city proper, and the people had retired to their houses. There was inconvenience and cessation of business, but no one apprehended serious danger. They surveyed the providence of God without fear, little thinking of the destruction that, swifter than the avalanche, would presently come through the heedlessness or the greed of man. 12 miles up the river eastward, and at an elevation of 450 feet above the city, lay Conemaugh Lake. This was an artificial reservoir covering 400 or perhaps 450 acres of land and having an average depth of 30 feet. Across the South Fork of the Conemaugh, about 2 miles above its junction with the main stream, had been built a dam 62 feet high in the center and 850 feet long. The valley, narrow at the dam, widened above into an extensive basin. Proposed in 1836 and authorized 3 years later, this reservoir had been finally constructed in 1852 as a feeder to the Pennsylvania Canal 14 miles below. A culvert at the bottom of the dam contained fine iron discharge pipes, each 2 feet in diameter, which could be opened at low water, thus sending the contents of the reservoir to the canal at Johnstown. In 1857, the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, having bought the canal, abandoned it, and the reservoir was thenceforth disused. In July 1862, the culvert beneath it gave way, owing to some imperfection of the foundation. The depth of water in the reservoir was, at the time, not greater than 40 feet, hardly more than half its actual capacity. The breach widened into a chasm, and the water of the reservoir was discharged, with the exception of about 8 feet at the bottom. But so slow was the process, owing to the substantial character of the dam and the resistance it presented, that little harm resulted. From 1862 to 1880, the reservoir was empty, and the property, containing something more than 500 acres, was a waste. In 1875, it was bought by Congressman John Riley, and was by him, 4 years later, transferred to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. This was an association of 3 gentlemen suggested and organized by Colonel B. F. Ruff, a successful railroad and tunnel contractor. All these parties had ceased from membership in the club prior to the Great Disaster. The original dam, constructed with care and solidity, had involved an expenditure of $240,000. It was built in regular layers and solidly rammed, and when finished was higher in the middle than at the ends, having a spillway cut through rock in the side of the hill. No engineer, good or bad, had charge of the work. The material used was, for the most part, not more substantial than shale and earth and straw. The pipes at the bottom were permanently closed, and as the dam advanced, the water was discharged through a board flume over the top. It was at first intended to raise the new dam to a height of no more than 40 feet, but it was presently discovered that to cut down the spillway through rock would cost more than to construct the dam to the original elevation. This was accordingly done, though not perfectly, as the dam was 2 or 3 feet lower than the old one and had, besides, a sag in the middle, a fatal mistake if once the water should begin to flow over the crest. Another mistake was the obstruction of the spillway with an iron grating placed to retain the fish, without taking the precaution at the same time to enlarge the passage. This would have been expensive, and here, as in the construction of the dam, it is apparent that economy was consulted. The sum of the mistakes made in the summer of 1880, and which culminated in the disaster of 1889, were, according to the report of a corps of engineers who made a careful survey, the lowering of the crest, the dishing or central sag of the crest, the closing of the bottom culvert, and the obstruction of the spillway. The people of the towns below had often discussed the possible rupture of the dam, but they scarcely feared it. Had it not been built by men who understood their business, and might not these be trusted, as men trust their lives to the doctor and their souls to the priest, it is certain that in the towns below, some were not thinking of the reservoir at all, while in case it should give way, few had formed the remotest conception of the possible disaster. Unsuspecting souls were they, and yet wholly like other men. Those long resident by the volcano have ceased to fear its fires. Familiarity, even with danger, breeds contempt. The evil which still delays, we fondly believe will never come. And as to the consequences, if those who build dams know so little, why should simple townsmen be expected to know more? Had they gauged that reservoir, and did they know that up there in the mountains were 640 millions of cubic feet of water, enough to make a veritable Niagara, for more than half an hour, ready to rush down upon them? Had they calculated the awful energy of 20 millions of tons of water falling 450 feet in a progress of a dozen miles, and this progress down a pent-up valley, in some places not more than 300 feet in width? Had they considered that the flow of a mountain of water, 60 feet high at starting, must be far more rapid on the top than at the bottom? The base, entangled among obstructions and overspreading them, would furnish to the water above an inclined plane, smooth as glass, along which it would shoot with the speed of an arrow to fall over the edge of the retarded water beneath, and furnish in its turn a ready passage for the water above and behind. That in consequence of this law, the flood would come not by a gradual rise, giving time for escape, but like a rolling mountain to smite with the impact of a falling asteroid and crush in an instant everything in its way. The crest of the dam stood 4 or 5 feet above the spillway. Towards noon of the 31st, persons on the watch saw the water of the reservoir rising at the rate of a foot an hour. Meanwhile, a rumor had spread that the dam was leaking, and this attracted other observers. Some declared that jets of water were leaping from the lower side to a distance of 30 feet. Somewhere about 2:30 o'clock, water began to run over the top. The structure was then evidently doomed, for, though riprap with stone on both slopes, no rampart of earth could long withstand the abrasion of a torrent running over its crest and down its lower face. A South Fork pastor reached the spot at 10 minutes before 3. A foot of water was then running over the dam. A few minutes later, a break was made large enough to admit the passage of a train of cars. Then, presently, the whole thing dissolved almost instantly. Like a phantom, a breach was made 429 feet wide, clean down to the bottom, and with the noise of 7 thunders and a tread that shook the hills like a young earthquake, out rushed a mountain of water tree-top high. At such a sight, the awed spectator could only gasp, "God have mercy on the people in the vale below." Rushing onward a mile in 3 minutes, or as some have claimed, twice or thrice as fast, in an instant, down went a mill, 2 houses and some barns. Up went an iron bridge tossed like a thing of straw, and a moment later, the flood was at South Fork. 2 trains, a passenger and a freight, detained by a washout further up the road, were standing at the station. Warned by the awful roar, the passenger train sprang out, just in time to save the lives of the people on board. The engineer of the freight, seeing it impossible to move with his heavy train, unhitched the locomotive, opened the throttle valve, and with the fireman, flew for life. The seething mountain leaped on the train and dragged it away, regardless of 2 brakemen, who surrendered their lives. The village of South Fork, standing in the angle above the junction of 2 streams and on high ground, was comparatively unharmed, though 2 lives and considerable property were destroyed. On rushed the river down a valley, having from the lake to Johnstown an average grade of more than 30 feet in a mile. A mile and a quarter below South Fork, the river strikes at right angles a projecting cliff. The baffled stream makes a detour of 2 miles and returns almost into itself, having accomplished an absolute advance of no more than 75 feet. A railroad cut no longer than this quits the river above, then regains and crosses it by a viaduct below. The railroad bed at the upper end of the cut is 20 feet above the stream, while at the lower end it is 70. Here the torrent divided a part of it, 20 feet deep and 40 feet above the riverbed, flowing through the cut, the other part following the channel around. When this latter portion returning struck the cliff at the lower end of the cut, the water rose to the enormous height of 125 feet. From this point, the monster, towering to heaven, and like a wild beast dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and ravening for prey, sprang upon Mineral Point, a little more than a mile below. The town was instantly wiped out, 40 houses being swept away, and 16 persons drowned. The rest doubtless were saved by clinging to the wreck, or warned by the ominous roar, they had fled to the neighboring hills. 2.5 miles below Mineral Point, the flood encountered another bend of the river, with a cut and viaduct, in all respects similar to that which has been described. Here again was enacted the grand and terrific scene which took place above. Then from this augmented height, the torrent swept down upon East Conemaugh and Franklin, a mile below. 3 passenger trains and 1 freight had been standing on the side track some hours, detained by the washout already mentioned. The passengers were reading, writing, conversing, worrying, walking up and down the tracks in the rain, or watching the driftwood and the constantly rising river, but conscious of no danger. Something was said about a reservoir somewhere up the road, which might burst and come down upon them. But they gave the matter no second thought. Twice was one of the trains compelled to move, as the water undermined the track and caused it to fall into the river. Once they were startled by the crash of a bridge, which yielded to the rushing waters and was swept away. It was near the hour of 4 in the afternoon, and they were still wearily waiting. Suddenly they were startled by the long, shrill shriek close to their ears of Engineer Hess's whistle, and looking out of their windows up the river, they saw an enormous mass of wreckage, roots, trees, and driftwood, borne aloft on the back of the torrent and rushing toward them. With one impulse, the most of the passengers leaped from the trains and fled for their lives. Between the trains and the town there was a ditch 10 feet wide and 5.5 feet deep and filled with water. Gaining the hill, they turned to behold a grand and awful scene. The crashing, tumbling buildings lifted from their foundations and hurled against each other, the shrieks and cries and screams of agonizing, despairing, dying men and women, and all Conemaugh going down in the fierce river. All the trains were carried away. In some of the cars the passengers could yet be seen, while on the top of one car, loosened from the rest, were 2 men struggling desperately to keep their hold as it rolled from side to side. The whole 4 trains drifted down about 500 feet when they were stopped in a singular manner. Some inexplicable movement of the water lifted the head of one train and threw it across that of the other. Engines from the roundhouse were rolled down and piled against these. A mass of trees and drift were added, and the whole 4 trains, with the exception of 2 or 3 cars, were arrested and anchored in the midst of the flood. The lives of 24 were lost, while of the passengers on the trains, 26 are known to have perished. A quarter of a mile below East Connemore was the town of Woodvale. The story of its calamity has few details, since all its 5,000 inhabitants were either drowning or engaged in a mad struggle for their lives. Every one of its 800 houses was lifted in a minute. Not one remained, nothing but parts of the walls of the large wool and flour mills. To the hills 40 or 60 rods distant, not many succeeded in escaping. Relatively, but few attempted it, for when the whistle sounded the alarm, the hills were too distant and the flood was too near. Such as fled were overtaken by the raging waters, and to make destruction doubly sure, a freight train was standing between them and the hill, and this, at the supreme moment, began to move. Thus many perished, when there was but a step between them and deliverance. Laden with corpses and debris gathered from 5 towns, with cars and trees and all the nameless accumulation from a valley 12 miles long, the torrent now swept down on Connemore Borough. This in turn was quickly swept away, though more of the inhabitants succeeded in escaping to the hills. At the lower end of the borough were the Gautier Mills, a part of the great Cambria Iron Company's plant. These occupied perhaps 10 or 12 acres of ground. When the flood struck them with their hundreds of fierce fires, there were thunderous explosions that shook the hills, and the whole seemed to rise up at once and slide forward on the slanting flood. 1 or 2 experiences from this part of the town must suffice for hundreds more. One lady drifted far down across the 7th ward and lay all night among the wreckage, within easy reach of 7 dead persons, while the luxuriant hair of a dead woman drifted frequently across her face half-buried, beneath the water. A wealthy German lady, a prominent member of the Lutheran Church, said, "My son Henry and his wife, my son Charles and my son-in-law were all drowned. My pastor and his wife and 4 nice little children were lost. There is not one brick of our good big church left on top of another, and here is the key, which alone remains. I think my heart must break from overmuch sorrow."